Hello, today I'm going to show you how to do a mattress stitch join for motifs or granny squares. It's one of my favourite ways of joining squares just because it just looks so nice, especially where the motifs join in the corner. I think it just gives a really nice professional look, and it also doesn't add a massive amount of bulk to the fabric that a crocheted join can do. So this is actually a scarf I'm making with my own motif, which will eventually be available on my website. I've nearly finished. I've just got to add 2 more motifs onto it. So the way I'm joining these is that I'm joining 2 at a time and then adding joining the 2 once they've been joined along the a longer section, which involves 4 points intersecting, and I'll go over how you sew that element to make it look really neat. So first of all, I always finish off all my motifs with an invisible bind off or a sewn finish, so I don't do a slip stitch join fast enough because it leaves a little lump, which is really difficult to, when you're sewing, to disguise. It's also quite annoying because you get to it and you're not really sure what's going on, which is why I use a sewn bind off. So I'm going to get a piece of thread that is about twice as long as the seam I want to join. The other thing to bear in mind is that you want a colour that matches more or less one of your motifs. If you have a colour that's too dark or too light, it will show. So you can see here, you can't really see the stitches unless you really pull it, which hopefully you're not going to do. But in general, you can't really see where you've sewn, but it does tend to pop out a bit more if there's a massive colour difference. So if it's too light or too dark compared to the motifs you're actually going to sew. So I've threaded my needle and I'm now ready to sew these 2 pieces together. So when I'm doing this mattress stitch, you can see it leaves this really nice finish along here, and that's because I'm going through the middle of the stitch. So by that I mean where you've got the front loop and the back loop, I'm always going straight through the middle. So I'm only using the back loop really. But in terms of when I'm describing what I'm doing, I will basically be saying I'm going through the middle of the stitch. It's basically a bit like a running stitch. So if you imagine you were just doing a basic running stitch without joining another piece together, and you were just doing a running stitch along the edge of this piece, you literally just be going down into the stitch, up through the stitch, down into the stitch, up through the stitch, to create a running stitch. So a mattress stitch with these motifs, with the crocheted edge, is basically just like a running stitch that you're alternating between the top piece and the bottom piece. So you go down through a stitch, up through a stitch, and then the matching stitches on the other side, you do the same thing, down through a stitch, up through a stitch. So each time you're sewing, you're making a stitch, you are alternating between the 2. And then when you pull the thread tight, that's what creates that lovely join. So although you're always using 2 stitches, to start with there's a slight anomaly. You're only going to use 1 stitch. So remembering that I've got a chain 2 corner, and each one of those chain 2s, one of the chains belongs to each side. So I'm always going to start in the second chain 2, because that's the chain 1 that belongs to this edge. So just to start, down through the stitch, and leave yourself a bit of a tail. And then on the top piece I'm going to find my second chain, or the first chain in this case, of this edge. I've got chain 2 space there, so that's my chain, and I need to find the first stitch. So I go down through the chain and up through the first stitch, and then I need to match that up with the bottom. So I'm going to go back into this stitch what I've already gone into, because that's just the anomaly for starting, down into that chain, up into the first stitch. And now it gets simpler, because you're basically just going matching these 2 stitches on here with the 2 stitches on the other motif. So you're always going down through the stitch, up through the stitch. And on the bottom piece, down through the stitch, up through the stitch, down through the stitch, up through the stitch, down through the stitch, up through the stitch. So here what I'd say is you need to be quite careful of the top motif, because it's really easy to inadvertently go into the same stitch twice, just because of the way the top stitch, the stitches, when you sew into it, the thread tends to kind of fall very far over to the right. So when you quickly look at the stitch, you might think you haven't worked into it. For example, this one here, at a first glance you might think you haven't worked into that. So you just got to keep a good eye on what you're doing in regards to the top row. So every now and then, if it's not a massive motif and you've only got like 20 stitches or so or less, then while you're getting used to it, it doesn't it's quite a good idea sometimes just to count how many stitches you've got left, remembering that the top, you're always starting on the top row, the top 2 matching with the top, the 2 on the bottom motif. So I'm going down through the stitch, up through the stitch. On the bottom motif, down through the stitch and up, down through the stitch and up. And if you find, often what you might find is that you've got too many stitches left as you're coming closer to the end, it's probably most likely to be, whoops, lost my thread, it's probably most likely to be the top motif where you've inadvertently gone into the same stitch twice. So the other problem you might come across, because we're all human and you may have made loads of motifs that should all have the same number of stitches, you might come across a motif where the stitches don't match up, so you might have too many or too few. So the trick is to always work into the stitch you've got too many of, too few of twice. So I'm going to, let's get a bit closer to the end, and then I'm going to deliberately make my stitch count wrong so that I can explain what I mean. So here I'm actually going to tighten these off now, so you can leave it maybe 12 or so stitches before you pull, but this bit is, I always think this bit's quite magical as you pull it. Everything closes up beautifully. You just make sure you don't inadvertently pull your end out. So make sure you just leave long enough tail to sew in. If you know me, you'll know that I always have very short tails because I hate wasting this lovely hand-dyed yarn. So for me, that's a long enough tail for sewing in. You might want something a bit longer. So this is just something to be aware of with this mattress stitch. As you pull to tighten it, you just got to be careful you're not pulling that end out. So there. So also note about tension with this mattress stitch. You really need it to try and match the tension of your crochet. So it needs to have the same elasticity. Obviously if it's got too much, I'm just deliberately overstretching this now just to show you, then you can see the stitches. If you pull it too tight, I think you'll obviously know what this is, it will pucker up the work. And if you have a large body of fabric, as in a scarf like this, and you've pulled all the stitches too tight, it will pucker up all your motifs, and also the drape of the fabric and the stretch of the fabric will be compromised. So this is something just to get used to. I tend to just do you know, maybe about 12-14 stitches, and then just pull it gently to match the tension of the fabric that I'm sewing together. So I'm just going to do a quick check here to make sure that I'm matching up to the end. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, because I'm counting the chain, one of the chain ones in the corner. And then here I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, I know, because this is I haven't done the bottom one. So that's right. So remember, I did the top first, then the bottom. So that's why I had 9 there and only 7 there, because I hadn't done the bottom 2 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm actually going to deliberately balls up the next stitch just to show you what to do if your stitch count as you come. As I come about 3/4 of the way along, that's when I'll check to make sure that it's going to finish neatly on the end. So here I have got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's say that stitch count is wrong, not because my sewing is wrong, but because I've made these squares wrong. So obviously you're not going to completely unravel one of those squares for the sake of one stitch. So forgive me if this seems completely obvious, but what you would do is on the row where you've got too few stitches, you would just work into one of the stitches again, rather than skipping a stitch on the row you have too many of, because that's far more obvious, because that can leave a hole, whereas going through the same stitch twice very often isn't that visible. So let's go through here as normal, and then because I've got one too few on this side, I'm going to go back through that one I've already been through to help make up the stitch that I was missing, and then just carry on as normal. So another thing I just want to mention about when you're sewing through these is you are actually just trying to catch that last loop, rather than go right through the middle and inadvertently catch a load of other parts of the stitch. It does look neater when you just get that back loop. So now these last 2 stitches, one is a crochet stitch, a double crochet, and the other one is a chain. And again, you're just treating that chain as if it was a normal stitch. So you're just going through one of the loops. So there, that matches up perfectly. So what you'll find is, even though your stitch count matches up perfectly, because crochet stitches tend to lean over to the right sort of thing, or in this case these are leaning over to the left, you always get a little bit of a jolt there. But once you've blocked, and in this case I'm going to be putting a border on here, that isn't so obvious. So don't be tempted to try and correct that jolt by eye by then using up the other chain 2 from this corner, because all that will happen is when you come to put your border on, all the stitches will be out of sync. So you've just got to be aware of which stitches you're going into and make sure they're the right one. Obviously if it looks completely off, you know, like you've got a massive bit jutting out here or at the top, then you know something has obviously gone wrong while you were sewing, or maybe the motif was wrong in the first place. So now I'm just going to show you that end's got very short. So if that end does get short, you can pull it out a bit. So I'm just going to double check the tension of that a minute, which looks absolutely perfect. And as you can see, even when you give it a pull, it all looks pretty good. So to finish off, I'm just going to flip the work over. I'm going to go back exactly through the same spot that it came out of on this thread came out of on the chain one on the other side, and then I'm going to sort of follow the footsteps of the yarn back through the way it came, just for a couple of stitches, being careful not to pull it tight. So the important thing about this is that you don't want to be coming through onto the right side of the fabric. It doesn't want to focus now, does it? It's okay. So I just tend to go along maybe for about 4 or 5 stitches, and again make sure your tension matches. And now I'm just going to go back on myself, making sure I'm catching in another bit of yarn. And now I actually try and sew through this bit of thread on this side. I'm just trying to split the thread a bit. This is just an extra way to make sure it's not going to come undone. So again, here I found the thread I was seaming with, this bit, and I'm just actually split it with the needle, and I'm going through the middle of it. And that sometimes is the beauty of using these multicoloured yarns, because you can sometimes see the stitches much more clearly in contrast with the different coloured stitches you're sewing into. So there's that side done. Now I'm going to just finish off this side in exactly the same way. And again, I've got a very short thread here, so it should be alright. So I'm going back up where this one came from, and then I'm going to follow it round. Actually, I'm going to try and split it there. If you can get the thread into itself at some point. So when if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know that what to do with these little short ends once you can't really thread them anymore. You thread your needle first, and then put the needle into the fabric first rather, and then thread it. So I think one more, and then that should be enough, and then I'm going to go back on myself. Again, making sure my tension matches the rest of the work. And then I'm going to try and split that thread back up. Go back up into the thread. Just for a bit of extra security. It's a total nightmare if you've done something wrong, you've got to unpick that, but in terms of a long lasting, I mean, the bits always end up popping out anyway at some point. That's just, you know, handmade product, as long as it doesn't actually come unravelled. Okay, so there we are. That's now done. Looks pretty good. And I'm ready to join it to the rest of the scarf. Okay, and again, I'm just going to try and get a piece of yarn that kind of, I know there's lots of colours going on here, but I think predominantly it's kind of purpley colour. So I'm going to get a bit of yarn, and I'm aiming for about just over twice the length of the area I actually want to join. And again, this is the same principle as before. We're going to start off in the same way. The only difference here is when we get to this bit where the 4 sections meet. So we're going down into the first chain that belongs to this edge, making sure we leave a bit of a tail, and then down into the first chain of this edge and up through the first stitch, back down through the very first stitch we went into that chain and up through the first back loop of the double crochet. Okay, and then carrying on along here, down and up, down and up. Okay, so I've come to the end of this, almost the end of this row, end of these edges. I need to, I've got one chain left from this side, so I'm going to go, and one chain left from this side. So instead of ending up with ending on two stitches, I'm ending on one, so it's not a problem. So I'm going to go down into this one and down into the last chain from this one, and join those up. Now, to make the point where they all meet in the middle really neat, what I do is I go round in a circle to pull those up nice and tight. So first of all, you need to make sure you've sorted out the tension on this row nicely, on this seam to match your work. Before you start doing this, because once this bit is done, that kind of becomes so tight that you can't really adjust this seam anymore. So it's the same basic principles of going down into the stitch and up through the stitch, but we are only working into the chain 2 of each corner. So where they're already joined, this can be slightly confusing. You'll just have to do the best you can. Once you've done it a few times, it is easier to find and see what you're doing. So I have just been down through this the first chain in this motif of the chain 2 corner, which means I've got to come up through the second chain. Now I'm going into this motif, down through the first chain, up through the second. Oops, sorry. Now I've got this motif which is already joined, but you can still quite clearly see the chains on this one. So down through that chain, up through the second chain, and then here I can see the 2 chains here, one there, one there. So I'm going down through that chain, up through that chain, back round this one, got my chain here, down through that chain, up through that chain. Now in this case you have to be quite careful that you don't inadvertently split through the thread that you're seaming with, because you won't be able to do the next step properly otherwise. And then back into this one, this pink motif. So I can already see where I've been, so I need to go back through there, down and up, but avoiding the yarn. And then what you can do is, you can see I've gone round in a ring through the chains in the same way, and then I just pull that tight, and it's like magic. It looks really nice. So remember, I've used one chain already from this corner. So now I need to start again on this side, down through the first chain, up through the first stitch, down through the first chain of that, which has already got a couple of stitches in it, and up through the next. This is just to reset it to all match up again, and then we're going to continue as before, down through the first stitch and up through the next, down, up. Okay, so all the ends are sewn in, and this corner's done. And typically this corner doesn't look as good as previous ones I've made. It might not be due to sewing, it might be due to how I made that motif. But anyway, if you do find that you're not very happy with something, don't forget, you can always do a bit of sewing. I think it's because this stitch is a bit, let's have a look, is a bit loose. Yeah, one of those chains I made was a bit baggy. You can see when I pull it at the back, it does kind of sort it out. So that does bother me. So I'm just going to see. If I can just neaten that up a bit by pulling that in with an additional stitch. Okay, I think that does look a bit better now. So obviously, if this this is right at the end of the scarf, so it's going to be visible, more visible than if it was in the middle of the scarf somewhere. So that's why that's kind of bothered me a bit. But I think that looks better now. Yeah, so I basically just used a little bit of thread to neaten up one of my chains, which was a bit baggy. But again, that's just, you can't really get perfection with handmade. Well, you can, but you know, it might not bother some people, but I want it to look right. So you can always correct any slight anomalies with an additional bit of sewing. And I've just got to make sure that that's not showing through on the other side. Have a quick look, trim that off. Okay, that's better, I'm happier with that. Okay, so that's how you join with a mattress stitch, and also how you can get a nice neat corner. I hope you enjoyed that. If you follow my blog, you'll also you'll also be notified when I've released the pattern for this. Thank you.